Gilder there talks about this relationship between large corporations and the government. And I think those of us who are defenders of markets have been insufficiently attentive to the power of that criticism. The left actually has a point because large corporations, for the most part, are not pro market. Large corporations are not pro market. They are happy to be complicit with the state in restricting the market. And so those of us who are market defenders often have a little trouble finding allies because the big companies in the US will often they're happy to say we need less government, but that's not really true. What they want is favorable regulation. And so being pro market can be a lonely job. So I will begin my talk. And I guess I want to begin it in kind of a strange place. Cicero, in his book of Duty, talks about the real estate market in Rome. And this is from book 3 of chapter 15 of Duty. Quintus Scaevola, the son of Publius, when he asked to have the price of an estate that he was buying named once for all, and the seller had complied with his request, said he thought it worth more, and added 100,000 sesterces. There is no one who would say that this was not the act of a good man, but men in general would not regard it as the act of a wise man, any more than if he'd sold an estate for less than it would bring. This, then, is the mischievous doctrine, regarding some men as good and others as wise. Now, what I think is this is a 2,000-year-old passage, so it's quite ancient. But if I'm trying to buy a condo, a flat in Tel Aviv, and the seller names a price, and I say, no, that's too little. It's worth more than that. That's not the way these negotiations take place. I'm secretly thinking, yes, that's great. That's a really cheap price. The seller doesn't know that it's worth more. And so I would quickly contract for it. Notice the distinction that Cicero is making between being wise and good. The question is, it seems as if capitalism and commerce encourages people to be wise, that is, to try to increase their profits. But can people also be good? Can people in capitalism also be good in the sense that they do not pursue the kind of rent-seeking or government favors that can make capitalism, as George Gilder rightly said, that can make capitalism problematic? So this old text is my starting point. And I found in, this is a paper by Mizrahi and Friedman in the Journal of Value Leadership, an interesting, some elaborations of market regulations in Torah. So a quotation from the Babylonian Talmud, there's a restriction. Market officers are appointed to supervise both measures and prices on account of deceivers. So there's government regulation of measures and prices. Now, what are measures? Well, today it's, if I tell you I'm going to sell you a liter of wheat, there has to be an actual liter of it. If I'm going to sell you a kilogram of tomatoes, we make sure that the weights are actually accurate. So you can see why you might have regulation for accurate measures of weights and volume. But do we need regulation of prices? And so, interestingly, the Rabbi Rashbam did not feel the need for regulation and advocated for a free market economy. In some of his comments on the Talmud, in Midrash, he wrote, market officers are not appointed to supervise prices and prevent major merchants from selling high. It is logical that this is not necessary. For if one wants to sell at a high price, another who needs money will sell more cheaply. All the buyers will go to him, and the first will be forced to sell cheaply. This is remarkable. This is from the 12th century. So in the 12th century, there's an argument here for the power of competition in markets to regulate the desires of greed and to prevent people from taking advantage of each other. So while we might need, Rushbaum might say, we might need regulation of measures, we don't need regulation of prices. And in fact, regulation of prices is likely to be harmful. So I had never seen this passage before. I think I'm probably going to write something about it. It's one of the earliest clear statements that I know of, since it's from the 12th century, of the power of competitive markets to make people act as if they cared about other people. Because notice, people are charging a cheap price, not that because they care about other people, but because they care about their own welfare. But it has, in effect, it makes people act as if the market system can make people act as if they cared about others. Well, I worry that many of you have never encountered a coherent definition of what markets are. And so Gilder didn't really describe this. He kind of started in the middle. I want to give you, and it takes a few minutes, but I want to make sure you understand what the actual market for capitalism is. So I will try to be quick, but it actually takes a few steps. The most important thing that many people don't recognize is that the entire system is based on exchange. And the power of voluntary exchange is that both parties to a voluntary exchange are better off. Both parties to a voluntary exchange are better off. If I have alternatives where I can obtain the thing that I want, and you have alternatives where you can sell to other people, the fact that I acquire the thing from you means that both of us are doing the best we can. Now, the advantage of exchange relations is that people will negotiate and find their own best sources, either to buy or to sell. And this doesn't require very much. Adam Smith said that people had a seemingly innate propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. People are just interested in making themselves and other people better off. Because one of the things about exchange, and I don't think we emphasize this enough, exchange entails the doctrine of the double thank you. The double thank you means that both of us are better off. So if I go into a Starbucks and I buy the equivalent of a $12 latte, then I say thank you when the barista gives it to me, and the barista says thank you when she receives the $12. Both of us are better off. So all of this operating on the doctrine of the double thank you, everyone is made better off by exchange, is something I think that we often miss. And so the policy implication is we want to have as many different voluntary exchanges as are possible. And the thing is that no state, no bureaucrat could possibly be aware of all of the opportunities for exchange. So operating under any sort of capitalist or market society is this willingness and, in fact, desire that people have to exchange, to make both parties to the exchange better off. Now, it is certainly true that I might want to use government regulation to restrict your choices so that I have a monopoly. But in a market system, both parties to the exchange are better off. Well, the second level, the yellow, the inside part of the concentric circle, is markets. What is the difference between markets and exchange? Well, exchange could be barter, or it could be something simple involving a currency. A market society involves the development and evolution of institutions that facilitate and reduce the transactions cost of exchange. So if we have some kind of system for enforcing agreements, we have a system for adjudicating disputes, we have a currency system that allows us to, we don't have to have the double coincidence of wants that is required by barter. The advantage of market society is that it begins to happen. And so if you're interested in the concept that motivates the difference, market society works at scale. And while exchanges are great and both parties are better off, market society allows the beginning of the development of the single most important factor in the argument for markets. If you remember nothing else that I say today, remember this. The single most important factor in the argument for markets is division of labor. So Adam Smith recognized in chapter 3 of book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, the chapter title is a theorem. It says that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So if I live in a small society of 100 people, if we want music, we have one guy who plays on a hollow log with bones. But if I live in a city of 1,000 people, there might be someone who can spend time to learn to play the violin. And if I live in a city of 1,000,000 people, we have a symphony orchestra. So the degree of specialization it depends on the size of the cooperation horizon. Market societies make people want to be part of something larger than themselves because the elaboration of division of labor and the operation of exchange relations at scale make an enormous difference in the welfare of society. Notice that you also start to get international exchange, because whereas exchange might take place only within a city or people that are able to coexist peacefully, markets want people to coexist peacefully across the entire world. So market society tends to want to extend globally to give people reasons to cooperate and find ways to exchange and help each other. But the concept that drives that is division of labor. So now we have a thriving global market, and we see division of labor. Some people specialize in making socks. Some people specialize in making exotic food. Some people make wine. And all of these things are available cheaper and better than they would be if we tried to make all of them ourselves. In a society where everyone tries to make everything themselves is poor. A society where we specialize in making the things that we're best at and exchanging them for things that other people are best at will have dramatically more wealth. So that's the basis of wealth in a market society. Well, what then is the smallest of these concentric circles that I have marked in green as capitalism? There's a number of market societies that are not capitalist. People have noted that China, for example, is close to a market society. It's not exactly one, but for the most part, they use prices and money and profits. But capitalism is an additional thing. And the single word that describes the argument for capitalism is something that you might not expect. I often ask people, what is the argument for capitalism? What is the one word argument for capitalism? And take a second and think what you think it is. It's liquidity. The one word argument for capitalism is liquidity. Liquidity is a way to use resources that do not yet exist to create factories and new systems of doing business. In a capital system, I can sell stock or equity shares against future profits. And entrepreneurs say, I am going to pay something into that corporation, and they are going to use that liquidity in order to create physical capital that they will then use to make a product, and the profits that result from that will be the way that they will pay back the money that they have either borrowed or that exists as equity shares. Now, this seems almost like magic. Capitalism, through liquidity, through the direction of liquidity, allows wealth that does not yet exist to be used to create goods and services. Now, it isn't easy. Capitalism requires a financial system, futures markets, and a variety of pretty fragile institutions. And so we saw in the Gilder video the discussion of Sarbanes-Oxley. More recently, we saw Dodd-Frank. These are regulations in the US, but they are regulations that make capitalism much harder to operate because they restrict the dynamism of the direction of liquidity. So let me make sure you understand what liquidity is, because I think it's very important. Liquidity is directing a fire hose of adaptable resources to the highest profit opportunities that are available in the world. Now, I'm going to say in a minute why profit is important, but I wanted to get this taxonomy down first. So, capitalism is a system for generating and directing this big fire hose of adaptable value, because a factory is capital. A forklift is capital. That's something we can use to produce things. Liquidity is adaptable capital that has not yet taken physical form. And what that means is I can take value from one part of the society and direct it to another part of the society where the potential profits are higher. Now, let me say then, having described these three levels, exchange is first. Many societies engage in exchange. Market societies require some additional institutions, such as a currency, some kind of form of banking, the ability to adjudicate disputes, a system of property rights where I expect that I'll be able to enjoy the fruits of my labors. And markets are a way of elaborating division of labor. Capitalism is a much smaller, in some ways more fragile system that operates only in market societies. Capitalism does require market societies, but in addition, it has a set of financial institutions and futures markets that allows the market to direct adaptable, valuable resources to the highest valued use. Now, how does capitalism actually work? I'm an entrepreneur, and I have an idea to make a widget. Now, a widget is something that an economists use as a way of describing something that it doesn't really matter what it is. It's potentially valuable and they want to sell it. So I have a widget. I have in mind a new thing that I want to sell, and I imagine that consumers will want to buy it. So I borrow or sell stock as a way of raising liquidity. I then go into input markets and I write voluntary contracts. These voluntary contracts involve me acquiring labor, plastic, energy, a physical factory, land on which to put it, transportation services. All of those voluntary contracts that I have written make each of my contracted parties better off. I have already created a lot of value because all of my input suppliers could have sold their valuable input somewhere else, but they sold it to me because that was the way that they could get the highest profits. I then take those valuable resources that I have contracted for and acquired through voluntary contracts, and I combined them in my factory into a widget. I then try to sell those things in voluntary output markets. So I put my widgets in stores, I sell them online, I make them available to consumers. And what happens? Well, maybe no one buys them because it's voluntary. No one has to buy them. I have to be right about my guess that these things are going to be valuable to consumers. If a lot of people buy them, and I think people miss the importance of this, if people buy the product, the widget that I'm trying to sell, it means that they value it higher than the production cost. I have set a price that covers my costs and generates some profits for my company. If someone buys it, the term in economics is consumer surplus, the amount that the consumer would be willing to pay has to be higher than the price they actually have to pay, or they won't buy it in the first place. That's the way voluntary transactions work. And so a bunch of consumers buy my widget, they pay the price that I have asked. That price is enough for me then to close all of the contracts that I had negotiated with the input suppliers. I pay off all the input suppliers and I have something left over. That something left over is a magical price that economists call profit. Profit is a sign that social value is being created. That is, I am, after paying off all the voluntary contracts for the input suppliers, I'm selling it in an output market, and people are willing to buy enough and at a high enough price that I have something left over. Now, profits are generally a signal that we need more of that thing, because it means that we could increase the amount that is produced and drive the price down, and people would still be better off. Often we can find a way to reduce our costs because of economies of scale. The more of the thing we produce, the lower the price is going to be. As a result, I am able to produce value in 3 domains. I realize I've said a lot of stuff, but wake up for a second. If I can be awake here at 3 in the morning, you could be awake at 9 in the morning. There are 3 domains in which I have created value. 1, the input markets, all those voluntary exchanges, I have made all those input suppliers better off. 2, in the output market, I have made all of the consumers who bought the widget better off because they were willing to pay a higher price than they had to pay because of competition. 3rd, I've created value for myself in the form of profits. Often we look at profits as if that was the only value that's been created. Look at the big profits that capitalist is making. We're forgetting the enormous value that is being created by all the jobs, all of the inputs that are being created by the making of these widgets. And we forget the fact that consumers, by definition, are made better off because all of them are able to acquire a product at a price lower than the maximum amount that they would pay, that lower than the actual value to them. So that's the argument for capitalism. The argument for capitalism is that exchange relations, which are based on voluntary exchange, often grow into market societies that elaborate division of labor. Under some circumstances, sophisticated institutions of finance and futures market are developed that allow capitalism to emerge. Capitalism allows the creation of liquidity, the generation of liquidity to direct unformed value into actual physical assets that produce things. In a capitalist system that's functioning properly, we're creating value in 3 domains. Input markets, people are being made better off. Consumers are being made better off, and the people who have made investments make an earned return because they have created value in those other domains. So in a competitive system, they have earned that because they have created new social value. So I've said a lot just there. Let's take 30 seconds and think and see if anybody has a clarifying question.
Hey, can you hear me? So you talk about how it is proof that when a consumer buys a product, it means that he's better off. But when you have monopolies and stuff like that, they still buy it, but there is something wrong about the system. So can you maybe talk about like it's hard to say what my question is, but I feel like maybe how can we know that something is not off in capitalism altogether? Maybe something like that.
Right. Thank you. That certainly is the right question. So notice that what I cleverly did was over and over again, I said in a competitive system, I said if markets are competitive. Now, you can say that even in monopoly, it must be true that the consumer is better off, but suppose that it's a medicine, and this medicine is, I have to have it or I will die. And so it's $1,000 per pill. Okay, maybe I'm still better off, but what about monopoly? What about market power? So in a capitalist system, what if big capitalist firms have market power? Well, that's exactly the right question. And I wish I could pay you. I wish I could be there to shake your hand, because it's much better if someone from the audience asks that question. Everybody was thinking it, but thank you for being brave enough to say it. Where does monopoly come from? Why is it that in this system we don't always see capitalism? Which is why I was so pleased to find that quote from Rabbi Rasham earlier, because he said we don't need to regulate price. Competition will regulate price. I will buy from someone else at a cheaper price, and that way the person who was charging the higher price, they won't be able to get that high price. They will have to lower their price. Well, suppose that someone has a monopoly. Where would that monopoly come from? And generally, the answer is the only place you can get a secure monopoly is from the state. So notice that there's no role for the state here except in enforcing property rights, adjudicating disputes, making sure that people don't steal money. But what if the state takes a more active role? And again, the George Gilder video did a good job on this. Large corporations don't like competition. Large corporations, in fact, like to have restrictions on competition. That's what monopoly is. And so the reason that I started out with the question of value and virtue is that there's a problem. There is a problem in capitalism that large capitalist firms may recognize that they can make more profits by investing, and I'm making air quotes, it's not really an investment because it's outside of the system that I have in this diagram, in lobbyists or making campaign contributions to members of the Knesset or supporting political parties that will provide them with benefits that take the form of restrictions on competition, patents, high licensing fees for new entrants. One of the things that Dodd-Frank, for example, in the American context did was make it much harder for small firms to enter. So the gentleman's question is exactly right. What if you have monopoly power? What if Goldman Sachs has very substantial monopoly power because state regulation of finance has made compliance costs really high and no new firms can enter? Well, that's where I want to turn now for the rest of my talk. And I appreciate your question, which is exactly the right one. So I might put it in the form of a theorem, and economists often use theorems. This is kind of a simple one. If a theorem always has an if part and a then part. If exchanges are voluntary, and I should say voluntary is a word that I made up. If you Google voluntary, the prefix EU means well or truly. And so if exchanges are truly voluntary. Now, if an exchange is truly voluntary, it means that we have ruled out monopoly, that there must be something like competition. And if profits are the excess of revenues over cost in a market without artificial constraints, then private entrepreneurship is always virtuous. It is the habit of alert seeking of exchange opportunities embedded in a character of forbearance of rent seeking opportunities. And so there we have raised the alternative to capitalism is good in the form of rent seeking. And so what I'm going to talk about is rent seeking as a threat to profit seeking. Profit seeking is the attempt to produce more, better, cheaper products in order to secure profits. Rent seeking is investment in government protection, in government help, in order to be insulated from competition. So on we go. There's a problem of sustainability. An owner-manager has a fiduciary duty to earn accounting profits. So can a manager of good character behave virtuously if rent-seeking opportunities are available? And what I mean by rent-seeking opportunities, a rent is an artificial benefit. Profits, if they are earned, come from the process that I have described. I can only make profits if I negotiate voluntary contracts with people that have alternatives, and if I can sell it to consumers who also have alternatives. Well, if I have a monopoly, they don't have alternatives. They have to buy it from me. So if I can acquire a monopoly through patents or government protection, that is a rent. A rent is a supernormal return that's based on artificial government action. So artificial action by the state to protect a corporation from competition, it can certainly create what look like profits, but they're not real profits. So a fiduciary is someone whose duty it is, I have a contractual obligation to earn profits for my stockholders. That's the way that corporations work. As a manager, I sign a contract saying that I will try to increase the profits for my stockholders. Now, one way I can do that is invest in plant. I can invest in a factory. I can find better workers. I can buy new customer service personnel. I can make sure that people want to buy my product. Or I can take that same money and invest in lawyers and lobbyists and make contributions to political parties. But notice that's not creating value, that's rent seeking. So the difference is I can make profits by creating value, or I can make profits by engaging in rent seeking. Rent seeking is immoral, but it's not illegal. Rent seeking is immoral. It is outside the system of capitalism, but it's not illegal, almost by definition, because I'm getting it from the government that decides what legality is. Well, might a manager of good character, someone who recognizes that rent seeking is immoral, might that person say, no, I refuse. I am only going to earn profits in the correct way? Notice that this takes us back to the original question that Cicero posed. So a manager who uses rent seeking to increase profits is wise. But a good manager would not engage in rent seeking. A good manager would say, that's wrong. I'm not going to do it. Even though it's legal, even though I could earn more accounting profits for my stockholders, it is wrong to use the government to protect the corporation from competition. Could such a manager survive? Well, the problem is that there are two mechanisms in capitalism that make it difficult for good, as opposed to wise, managers to survive. One is the competitive market for managers. So our manager right now says, I refuse to engage in rent seeking. I'm only going to pursue profits in the form that Munger talked about, with that the three concentric circles, and all the exchanges have to be voluntary. I refuse to pursue monopoly. We will fire that manager and find someone who is able to say, no, I'm going to pursue rent seeking. It is very likely that stockholders don't care. So having a manager of good character might not help. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that stockholders say, look, we think rent seeking is wrong. We will leave this manager of good character, that is the person who is good as opposed to simply wise. We will leave this person as manager. Well, that means that our share prices are below where they would be if we had someone who did engage in rent seeking. So I'm a corporate raider. I can go to a bank and say, look, if I buy this company and then install new management that pursues rent seeking, their profits are going to go up. I am going to be able to use that to pay back the loan that I'm going to use to make a tender offer to buy all of their stock. That means that the competitive mergers and acquisitions market is a threat to managers of good character. There will be a hostile takeover. We'll replace the virtuous managers with rent seekers. So notice that neither of this is not a Marxist critique. I'm not talking about expropriation of labor. I'm not talking about alienation. This is within the logic of capitalism itself. There are two processes that make it unlikely that virtue will be able to overcome rent seeking. One is the competitive market for managers. The second is the competitive market for mergers and acquisitions. Since it is possible to earn higher profits at some point by rent seeking, it is very tempting to recognize that one of those two competitive processes is going to replace virtuous managers with rent seeking. Now, the reason that I think this is important is I think that a lot of people on my side, a lot of defenders of markets, have done kind of a poor job of recognizing that there's a threat. And so it's important. I realize you people are too young to remember Star Wars, but I like Star Wars references. Grand Moff Tarkin, famously, the guy comes in and says, "We've analyzed their attack, sir, and there is a danger. Should I have your ship standing by?" And Governor Tarkin says, "Evacuate in our moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances." And of course, about 1 minute later, Luke Skywalker sends the torpedo down the hole that goes into the central reactor. The entire Death Star blows up, and we laugh at Governor Tarkin. Ha ha, you were wrong. We didn't overestimate their chances. There was a real threat. I believe that defenders of capitalism have been insufficiently attentive to the threat that is posed by the problems of rent seeking and monopoly. Just saying, well, oh, rent seeking, that's not capitalism. And the reason I started thinking this is that I make exactly that critique to my friends that are socialists. So I teach at Duke University. Perhaps not surprisingly, there's quite a few people that think of themselves as socialists. They tend not to be economists. They're usually in the literature department, and they like reading Marx's literature. But okay, fair enough. They're Marxists. I will say, look, socialism could never work. Look at Venezuela. Venezuela is a basket case. The economy, they were an oil-rich economy, but socialism is so inefficient that it even made a rich country like Venezuela poor. And they say, oh, well, that's not real socialism. Real socialism is prosperous. The socialism that I can imagine, that's prosperous. Well, all right. Capitalism has a problem, which is lobbying. So I found this from 2017. This was a discussion and comments on Medium. And there had been an article about the value of capitalism, and someone had written, I highlighted it, in my opinion, the most important problem of capitalism you didn't mention is lobbying. And the response from Tyler Hogg, oh, well, that's not capitalism, it's cronyism or corporatism, it's the opposite. Maybe, but if cronyism is what capitalism becomes in a democracy, then the critique of the left actually is dangerous. If I say, should I bring your ship? We've analyzed their attack. There's actually a danger. My side needs to concede that government created monopoly or market power is actually a problem in capitalism in a democracy. And most of us, I think, accept that democracy is required. We don't want dictatorship. So if you want capitalism in a democracy, you have to recognize that lobbying or cronyism is a potential problem. And so again, a discussion on Twitter, Betsy DeVos is going to let one company handle all federal student loans for $1 trillion. And Norm Eisen says, come on, that's not capitalism. Well, maybe it's not capitalism, but if it's what capitalism becomes, then since I think socialism doesn't work because socialism becomes authoritarianism, does capitalism really work if it becomes cronyism? So another Norm added, that's crony capitalism. Okay, whatever name you want to give it, we have to worry about the fact that the criticism is valid. So the point is, there is a danger. The defense is always, oh, that's not capitalism, that's cronyism. But what if cronyism is an essential feature in any democratic system that tries to be capitalist? And here I come to what is called public choice. Public choice may not be something that you've heard of, but I'm a past president of the Public Choice Society. I was an editor of the journal Public Choice. Public choice is an approach to political science and economics that looks at non-market institutions, but assumes that people are rational. So the basic assumptions are voters are passive and rationally uninformed. I know as a voter, I can't really influence the outcome. My votes tend to be focused on things that I wish for or things that I can imagine. Individual politicians benefit from cronyism because it increases their power. It gives them sources of campaign contributions, it means that large corporations are going to tell their workers, vote for this person. If you vote for Meyer, we'll be better off. And individual corporate CEOs benefit from cronyism because they can increase their profits, their stock options, and the amount of money that they get paid. So the only hope for one of those groups would be for one of those groups to act altruistically, putting the public good ahead of their own welfare. But one of the axioms of public choice is that we cannot rely on the goodwill of any individual. We're going to assume people act in their own self-interest. Now, public choice usually applies this logic to government. So people say, well, government's better than markets because in markets, people are self-interested, and in government, people care about the public welfare. That's not true. In government, people are self-interested also. We need to worry about the fact that people are self-interested. But we can't now say, well, what if corporate CEOs were good in addition to being wise? We can't assume that. We have to recognize that we're likely to be dealing with people who are greedy and selfish. So Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, this is something that is often quoted. Let me move this out of the way. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. It is impossible indeed to prevent such meetings by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice. Now, remember, Adam Smith is supposedly the person who was the great defender of capitalism. But here he's saying capitalism tends towards cronyism and monopoly. And so what that means is a conspiracy against the public, some contrivance to raise prices. I say, look, we're competing with each other. I'm at a meeting, we're playing golf, I'm talking to another corporate CEO. We're killing each other. We're competing. We don't need to do that. Tell you what, don't lower your prices below this certain level, and I won't lower my prices below that certain level. Now, it's actually difficult to enforce that because if one of us cheats on this agreement, we'll be able to make more profits. And so just as Rabbi Rasham said, if I try to charge a high price, my competitors are likely to charge a slightly lower price, and that's going to mean that we're going to have trouble enforcing this agreement. However, there is an entity that has guns. It's called government. And so if we want to have a conspiracy against the public or some contrivance to raise prices, the corporate CEOs are going to have a meeting and they're going to say, we're going to hire lobbyists. And those lobbyists are going to go to Washington. They're going to go to Jerusalem, and they're going to negotiate higher prices. Well, that's pretty upsetting because that means that capitalism is not sustainable. So Smith goes on, though the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from sometime assembling together, it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. A regulation which obliges all those of the same trade in a particular town to enter their names and places of abode in a public register facilitates such assemblies. A regulation which enables those of the same trade to tax themselves in order to provide for their poor gives them a common interest. So what Smith is saying is, look, you can't prevent these kinds of organizations, but you shouldn't encourage them. But notice that what Smith is saying is that a good public-spirited government official won't require meetings or trade associations or ways for industries to collude. The problem is, why would you assume that government officials are good and public-spirited? The fact is that government officials benefit from having rent seeking. You can't defend capitalism by assuming that government is benevolent. A democratic state will always want to make such assemblies necessary. So why is this important? Before I said that capitalism may not be sustainable because there's two competitive processes within capitalism that tend to lead towards cronyism. One is the competitive market for managers. The other is the market for mergers and acquisitions. There's an additional problem. Government itself likes cronyism. democratic governments will encourage cronyism. So even if you did have good rather than wise corporate managers, the state is like, and this certainly happened with Dodd-Frank. Barney Frank was the person in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's the Frank of Dodd-Frank. Barney Frank was the recipient of the most campaign contributions from Wall Street in all of the House of Representatives in 2009 and 2010. Unsurprisingly, he chose a set of regulations that benefited the large incumbent corporations. Now, it might be that they would have preferred not to be regulated. But since they knew they were going to be regulated, they made huge contributions to Barney Frank so that the regulation would benefit them and harm small firms. So we have to add the fact that in a democracy, individual members of the legislature themselves want cronyism because it benefits them. Now, does this harm the country? Yes. But individual self-interest is going to lead to the collapse, the potential collapse of the kind of capitalism that I was talking about at the beginning, the ideal form of capitalism. And so Alan Greenspan gets the best. I'm not very good at Photoshop. I apologize. But so we have Grand Moff Greenspan. We've analyzed their attacks, sir, and assuming altruistic corporate executive officers is silly, while invoking a benevolent government and violates the basic public choice theory. Should we admit that capitalism is unsustainable? And this is an actual quotation from Alan Greenspan. I believe it was in 2009. And people call it Greenspan's mea culpa. Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. So what Greenspan meant was there were a lot of big Wall Street firms, and the prospect of bankruptcy meant that they were going to lose a lot of money, and that should have disciplined them. They should have behaved better. They should have been more careful about having excessive debt. Why didn't they? Well, arguably, there's an old saying on Wall Street: if I owe you $1 million and I go bankrupt, I'm in trouble. If I owe you $100 million and I go bankrupt, you're in trouble. Because if I owe you $100 million and I go bankrupt and I don't pay you the $100 million, now you are in financial problems also. And so the key in financial markets, in a crony, not capitalist, but crony system, is to make sure that if you have debts, your debts are enormous. If your debts are large enough, the government will be forced to bail you out because you're too big to fail. So the problem was that regulators did not, or said they did not, foresee the fact that cronyism is a powerful urge in a capitalist system. That is, if you're large enough and you have monopoly power, you actually can work around the competition that makes the honest pursuit of profit so arduous. So monopoly is difficult to maintain in a capitalist system because competition is constantly challenging you. But if you can use the state, if you can, in a democracy, use the power of the state to create and sustain monopoly, then capitalism may not be sustainable. So to distinguish capitalism and cronyism, capitalism is a social system based upon the recognition of individual rights, including private property rights, where all goods are owned privately. An economy remains capitalist so long as the government or any other agency refrains from intervening coercively. Cronyism shares no such description. It's a social system where the government intervenes aggressively into the economy, typically with political instruments that benefit large corporations and enterprises to the detriment of smaller businesses. Subsidies, tariffs, import quotas, exclusive production privileges such as licenses, antitrust laws, and compulsory cartelization designs. So if we think of this as a dimension, and on the two extremes of the dimension are capitalism and socialism, there are no societies that are on those two endpoints. Socialism is something like all prices are managed, all production is planned. Cronyism is something like prices are managed for the benefits of large corporations. There may even be some overlap. So the problem is that capitalism always is going to tend to move towards the left here. And it moves to the left because the inherent logic of capitalism means that corporate CEOs can earn, and I'm making air quotes, they can obtain more profits by using the government rather than using competition. They'll stop investing in plant equipment and better products, and they'll start investing in lobbyists. So famously, Martin Shkreli had owned the ability to produce a particular drug, and he jacked prices up to about $800 a pill. The people who would die without using that drug, they were still better off being able to buy it. The reason he was able to charge such a high price, though, was that the FDA had created a monopoly. There was nobody else could enter that firm. Competition was foreclosed by state action. So you could say that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. So Friedrich Hayek famously wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom, where he said that there was a tendency towards socialism. Well, it seems to me that a Hayek, but of the left, now might be tempted to write a treatise called The Road to Crony Capitalism. The claim is that capitalism's not sustainable. Any attempt to set up capitalism in democracies is actually a step towards crony capitalism. Now, it's not impossible to maintain capitalism, but we need to recognize, just like Grand Moff Tarkin, there is a danger. We can't just dismiss it by the semantic trick of saying, oh, well, that's not capitalism. So if businesses maximize accounting profits, revenues minus expenditures, if politicians seek to maximize their own power, including but certainly not limited to their re-election probabilities, and if voters are poorly organized and poorly informed because of the collective action problem, that's pretty standard public choice. Taken together, that means capitalism is unsustainable and always converts to cronyism. So I've used two terms. Let me make sure that I can define them. Profits are the excess of revenue from selling a product after the costs are subtracted. If the exchanges are voluntary, each person buying the product must be better off. Entrepreneurs then seek profits and they try to create value. That is a virtuous system. Rent seeking is a competition for an artificial prize or benefit created either by taking money from taxpayers and giving it away, or a restriction on competition that allows an artificial increase in prices for products sold. Political entrepreneurs then seek rents. No value is created. So economists always write out the profit function, and it looks complicated, but it's just price times output, which is the production function. How much capital and labor do I put together, minus the interest rate times the amount of capital, minus wages times the amount of labor. So in order to earn a profit, I charge a price, I buy capital and labor, and I make the stuff and I sell it. And I've already talked about that. So the question is, what part of this could I get government help on? And it's only the stuff marked in red. All of it. All of it. I can get government support for prices. I can get government regulation of the production process. I can get government subsidies on the price of capital, and I can get government help on wages. So honest profit would mean that the government doesn't give corporations help, monopoly power on any of these things. We probably should be skeptical of that. So a rational economic actor is going to recognize that marginal profitability of rent seeking exceeds the returns to the pursuit of honest profit. And even if entrepreneurs forbear, if they try to say, no, I'm virtuous, that would be wrong, then a rational politician will recognize that power and electability can be improved by forcing a rent-seeking society on entrepreneurs. So the problem is, and those of you that have studied calculus will recognize this as a marginality condition, at some point, it becomes profitable to invest in lobbyists and rent seekers. So the only way capitalism can survive is if the last dollar devoted to honest profits is still more productive than the first dollar devoted to rent seeking. And it's easy to put this in the form of a graph. So the vertical axis is the marginal profitability of investment. The horizontal axis is the amount of investment spending. And as you have more and more investment spending, it becomes less profitable. So a company might be very profitable early in its life cycle. But as it invests more, it has larger plant, it invests more in engineers, its products mature, the marginal improvement in investment in profitability from more investment is likely to fall. Well, if you look at that top curve, it's declining, but it's always above the first dollar reward to lobbying. The other curve, though, is at some point, the return to honest capitalism falls below the first dollar reward to lobbying. And that's hardly surprising. At some point, it's likely to be more profitable to get government help, subsidies, tariffs, licenses, restrictions on entry by other potential producers than it is to try to play honest. So the temptation to be wise but not good in capitalism is very strong. So while Rabbi Rasham recognized that competition can discipline price, firms recognize that too, and they're likely to try to use some form of rent seeking. It's perfectly rational. It's just that it's immoral, but it's not illegal. And so the question that I leave you with is capitalism sustainable? The argument that I believe, the argument that I've made for capitalism, the argument that I made for capitalism at the beginning that prompted the excellent question, which is what I wanted someone to ask, was, okay, that all makes sense, but what about monopoly? Well, what about monopoly? We have to take that problem seriously. And it doesn't have to be full-on monopoly. It can just be market power. How can we prevent government? And that George Gilder said this too, that the recognition that you can increase your profits by getting government protection from competition is something that those of us who favor markets should recognize is a problem. And we need to be honest about the fact that capitalism itself needs to do some work to be pro-market, not pro-corporation. Well, that is my talk, and we have 25 or so minutes for questions or comments.
Good night, good morning. I don't know what to say, but first of all, thank you for staying with us so late. And my question is about the problem with lobbyists, for example, in the revolving doors in the defense, in the Pentagon in the US. I think it's the same in the banks in Israel. What would you say, first of all, if it's okay, in your opinion, what's going on with the ability to go from Lockheed Martin to the Pentagon and so forth? And if not, what can we do in Israel, in the bank systems and in the US to make a change without, with the ability to stay in the capitalistic world? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there were two parts to the question. I'm afraid that's just unavoidable in defense. So somebody that works for the defense agencies in the government or has experience in Israel and the IDF is likely just to know more about weapon systems. And so you need that experience in the companies that make weapons or that take weapons from, maybe you buy them from the US and you adapt them to IDF needs. There's probably no avoiding that. But the revolving door in regulation of the finance industry, for example, a big part of the reason for that is the large discretion that the state has to regulate banks. And so I didn't really talk about solutions. One solution would be, and this is a standard public choice argument, James Buchanan was one of the people who started public choice, and his solutions were mostly constitutional. We would need to have a constitutional restriction on the scope of government power over private corporations. That is less day-to-day regulation of price. If you want to have large regulations that apply to the entire industry, okay. But the big reason for the revolving door is that the benefits of working for private industry are so much larger than they are of working for the state. But people working for the state recognize they're more likely to be hired by the private company if they now do things that benefit the private company. So we would need constitutional restrictions that prevent government from directing private enterprise. And that's a pretty hard thing to accomplish. So I think you're right. For defense, it's impossible. For finance, maybe we have a shot, but it would require constitutional restrictions. There's one other answer. And so long as we have the ability for new companies to enter, for new dynamic industries to develop, because 20 years ago, cell phones weren't that big a thing. There were a lot of industries that didn't really exist 20 years ago. As long as we have new industries coming online, Uber didn't exist 20 years ago. In the United States, for a long time, Uber didn't have any lobbyists. Now they do have some as they mature. So if the economy is dynamic enough, it may be that we can survive for quite a while because new industries come online. But you're absolutely right. Revolving door is a problem. In defense, it's probably unavoidable, but we could restrict government's ability to help corporations through constitutional restrictions.
You talked about the question if capitalism still can be like about virtue and goodness. I wanted to ask if you think it's the difference between like classical capitalist and like neoliberal modern capitalist. When Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he also wrote about the theory of moral sentiment. And I feel it's just from my feeling, but maybe today they don't care about that. They don't care about capitalism that will have growth and will take us to good virtue. They just want the growth part.
That is certainly a good question because it connects with my theme about being good and being wise. If you read Wealth of Nations, and actually if you just read Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith is doing two things at once. Part of what Smith is doing is exhortation. He is saying this is the way that a good society would work. He's also saying, and there's some things about entrepreneurs that are pretty bad. And a lot of places in Wealth of Nations, he talks about business people as being schlubby. They're really not trustworthy, and we need a system that forces them to compete with each other. I think the big difference between Smith's time and our time is not in the nature of capitalism, it's in the nature of government. The expansion in government's capacity to help through tariffs, subsidies, all sorts of government actions that help corporations. A lot of that didn't exist in Smith time. That wasn't seen as something that government did. And so I was really grateful to have the Gilder video go before me, because one of the things that Gilder claims is that government now sees as its job the insulation of citizens from all risk. Well, if your job is to insulate citizens from risk, that gives you many more ways of intervening in capitalism. So I do, your question is a perceptive one. There is a big difference between now and Smith. I think Smith had a very clear-eyed vision of the problems of greed and the fact that people were going to try to cheat. In fact, that quotation that I gave you, he said they're going to conspire against the public and raise prices. That's right. The difference is the scope of government has increased since Smith's time. And like Gilder said, this urge to protect citizens from all risk opens Pandora's box to all sorts of favorable regulation and government subsidies that lead us much faster on the road to cronyism.
I have a question regarding the part of the voluntary exchange and sort of the moral framework that's behind it. Let's say, for example, that I like drinking Coca-Cola, I am the consumer, and I'm happy to do the exchange. I pay the money, they give me the can of Coca-Cola. And let's say, for example, that they have a polluting factory somewhere, and I don't pay the price for it. I'm not the one to like if I was paying the price for that, maybe as a consumer, I would decide not to consume. But I'm not paying the price, so I'm better off, they're better off, but there is someone else paying the price that I'm not sure. How is that good? How does that enter the moral framework? Thank you.
Thank you. If you Google, thank you for giving a chance for me to brag on myself. If you Google voluntary exchange, you'll see that I have written a series of papers on it. There's 6 conditions that are required for an exchange to be truly voluntary. And one of them involves no externalities for just the reason that you say. So if an exchange involves externalities, that means that there are costs or harms that are being costs or benefits that are being imposed on other people without their consent, maybe without their knowledge. So you're right, that makes it not truly voluntary. The question is, what is the role of the state in internalizing those externalities? And that's another way, an entering wedge for cronyism, because we're supposed to protect people from harms. And so externalities mean that we'll have a really extensive government regulation. A better solution would be torts. Torts are the ability to sue at law for damages. So if there are externalities, we could use the court system to force corporations to take account of the cost that they impose through their production process. Allowing government to regulate it is just a way of inviting more cronyism. So the 2-part answer to your question is, one, you're right about externalities, and I think that's condition 3 of the 6. If you look up voluntary, you'll find the description of the requirements. One of them is no externalities for just the reasons that you say. And the second point is that the solution has to be something like torts or legal action, not government regulation. If government is going to regulate externalities, that means that they can use taxes and subsidies to harm their enemies and reward their friends. Taxes and subsidies, I can use externalities as a justification for doing almost anything. And in fact, if you look at the history of regulation, there's a shocking amount of use of externalities as a justification for cronyism. But it's an excellent question. It's a really good point. So I would add externalities to the things that government has been licensed to protect us against. So it's this risk. We have to be protected against everything, like Gilder said. That's too much. That's a justification for bad action.
I have a question regarding the welfare society and the welfare systems. As you mentioned, in the way you see things, the main role of the government is preserving property rights and dispute resolution. I would like to know, how do you see, because let's assume that we have premature inequality in society, and also the way that the distribution of wealth in society is unequal. So don't you think another part of the role of government is to take care of health, I don't know, welfare, like social services and education, as part of I don't know, trying to avoid market failures in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Market failures, for the most part, are the problem of inefficient allocation because of things like externalities, public goods, asymmetric information. Those are all given as justifications for regulation. I'm a little worried about them because they can be exploited for rent seeking. You have raised one that is often also given as a market failure, and that is inequality. I guess I don't see inequality as being a per se market failure. It is likely that people have different abilities, and even if you just through luck make a product that a bunch of people want to buy, that means that you've created a lot of benefits for society. I don't really have a problem with pretty substantial inequality. you also said it in a way that I think is much more persuasive. And that is, in effect, doesn't society have some obligation to take care of those who are least well off? That is, not necessarily we want to have no inequality, but we want to make sure that the people at the bottom are able to live lives of dignity. I think that's a much more persuasive argument. So we might be persuaded that poverty and lack of access to basic healthcare, basic education, that those things are government roles. I've written a lot about this, and a lot of my libertarian friends are not very happy with me about it. I've actually concluded that something like healthcare, education, and a universal basic income are a way to reduce the concern that we have for the precariousness of life at the economic bottom. People have to have a sense that the game is fair. Now, you may or may not agree about universal basic income. That's very controversial. But I think that the idea of it being a job of the state to reduce inequality, a lot of the time, our concern is not actually with poor people, it's with rich people. What we want to do is get rid of the rich. That's not a concern about inequality. That is a sin called envy that's being turned into we're going to call it merit on the basis of social justice. So I am worried about envy that takes the political form of let's tax the rich. I'm much more sympathetic to the idea that we should use something like basic income, healthcare, and education to raise the position of the very poorest. So I guess I would agree in part and dissent in part from your claim. I'm not worried about inequality. I don't see why inequality is a problem. I do see that there is a problem with ensuring that those who are least well off are able to live a life of dignity and who feel like they're participating in a fair game. I have to ask, is there a no women rule?
There's one, two.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Michael. My question is regarding the medicine example. So,
say again, you broke up.
regarding the medicine example. Oh, okay. So in your example, you said that through disabling regulation and allowing free production of the medicine, the free market is going to result. But not every medicine recipe can be either rediscovered or stolen by other firms. What capitalism offers me in this solution, in this case, is a solution for both letting people live and giving property rights to the people who discovered the recipe.
Pharmaceuticals is healthcare generally, but pharmaceuticals in particular are one of the most difficult problems. The particular example that I chose, Martin Shkreli, I was careful to choose an example of a generic drug. So a generic drug in the United States is one whose patent has lapsed. So a company developed the drug, they paid all the cost of development, they got a patent on the drug, and then they produced it at a pretty high price, not a super high price, for 20 years. And then the patent expired and it became generic. Now, generic means that you have to, since the patent publishes the recipe for the drug and the patent has expired, then the recipe is public information and there's no patent protection. However, what the Obama administration did was to say, we need more regulation of generic drugs. We don't know who's making them. We want to control their production process. And what they did is actually a remarkable exercise in rent seeking. They said that if there's a generic drug being produced, before a new company can enter, they have to get the permission of the existing producers to say, we have insufficient capacity to produce enough of this drug. Well, unsurprisingly, the incumbents are going to say, well, we can produce plenty. And so almost nobody made this drug. Martin Shkreli bought the rights to produce the generic drug, which meant that he could protest if any new companies came online. And so he started charging $800 per pill. Immediately, companies tried to enter, but they were prevented by the regulation. And this was not a patent. This was additional regulation of a generic drug. Now, I realize that's all very specific, but rent seeking like this is always very specific. It's not some big thing saying, we are stealing your money here. It's some very specific, complicated regulation that makes it impossible for new entrants. So the reason that I use that example is precisely that it is not a pharmaceutical patent. I think you can make an argument that patents are a way of protecting the profits of companies that have invested a lot in developing the drug, because it's expensive to develop the drug. You have to go through clinical trials. But that's not what was going on here. I also think that the American pharmaceutical companies have recognized that they can make more profits by investing in lobbyists in order to extend the patents in ways that are not actually legitimate. And so the American pharmaceutical industry has just become a carnival of rent seeking. I think it would be possible to have shorter, more limited patents and still provide them with sufficient compensation for developing the drug. The patents are too long and it's too expensive. However, there is a counter argument. Almost no other country produces new drugs. The United States produces these drugs, and then we subsidize all the other countries in the world because American consumers pay high prices for the drugs. Other countries have price restrictions saying you can only charge a certain amount. Well, that's fine as long as American consumers are paying for everyone else in the world to have cheap drugs. But the American pharmaceutical companies, whatever else is wrong with them, are the source of most of the new valuable drugs and vaccines in the world. So I think you have to be careful before blaming the pharmaceutical companies too much. That's why I chose Martin Shkreli. That's a generic drug. It was not a pharmaceutical that was under patent.
Thank you for your time. So I just, not to waste your time, because okay, a question. You mentioned patents, so I was wondering if you're like pro or against patents, and if not, then I'll move on to my next question.
I am pro patents. I think that a limited term, probably less than half of the current term, is sufficient. The patents used to be valuable because it took such a long time to make stuff. Patents now often are a way for trolls to prevent other people from making things. So I think patents are fine, but instead of 20 years, I think 5 years would probably be enough. That would make industry much more dynamic. And 5 years is forever in the way that the current product cycle works. A lot of products that were made 5 years ago are now obsolete, but I'm a fan of patents.
Okay, so regarding externalities, you mentioned that you can sue other factories and stuff like that, and sometimes it's just not as clear who is who gets pollution is more straightforward, but for example global warming is more affecting a lot of entities, and sometimes it's in the future, and it is also hard sometimes to measure and understand and predict. But how would you address this?
Well, if the world were serious about global warming, we would have imposed a comprehensive carbon tax. So it is the power of large corporations and oil companies in particular that have prevented us from starting to solve the problem of global warming. Instead of imposing a comprehensive carbon tax, which is the obvious solution, because as you say, we may not be able to sue. It is difficult for lawsuits at that scale to operate. If you have an industry-wide tax, that's probably not the result of rent seeking. So if we had a comprehensive carbon tax, we could have done this 15 years ago during the Obama administration. But instead, what we did was have gigantic subsidies for different so-called green energies. Most of those have been wasted. Germany wasted an unbelievable, Germany now has the highest electricity prices in the developed world, because they spent all of this money on solar panels in a country that has no sun, particularly in the winter when it's cold. That's when they actually use most of their power. So the response to global warming was subsidies, precisely because of the power of corporations. What we needed was large externality taxes, but that wasn't possible because of the problem of corporate power. But you are right that under some circumstances, the problem is large enough that we might have to use taxes. But if they're large taxes and it's comprehensive, that's not, I'm going to tax particular companies. The way we often work on externalities is at a very small scale. And at that level, I think it is possible to do a better job with lawsuits. But you're quite right. The problem of global warming is a difficult one. If we were serious, we would have passed a carbon tax 15 years ago. We're not serious. We're busy rewarding large corporations instead of trying to take care of the planet.
Question is a bit in addition to the previous one. If we look at some markets or some things that affect our life, such as global warming, or for example, in the food industry, there are some, not supplements, but some things that are more restricted in Europe and Israel, for example, than in the US regarding what we eat and what we get inside our bodies, and global warming as well, and polluting. So is regulation, for you at least, is it acceptable to regulate those kind of substances and not exactly regulate the prices, or is it too much of rent seeking? Is there a probability of rent seeking there as well?
The hard case is always the marginal or edge instances. I am skeptical of the motivation behind the regulation of a lot of foods. So, for example, the concerns about genetically modified foods. Most scientists have now said the concern for genetically modified foods was never legitimate. It was actually a way of protecting existing food producers from more productive plants. And so I would like to think that we could trust scientists to be able to say we're above market pressures, but science is subject to fads also. On the third hand, we have to have some kinds of regulation for safety because of the problems of asymmetric information. So this is not a very helpful answer. I think that we are obliged to accept that there always will be and should be regulation in the public interest about health to prevent people from being defrauded. So in the United States, for example, you can buy all sorts of supplements that claim to do basically magic things, cure cancer, make you lose weight, and grow your hair back. None of those things are true. If these were drugs, then you wouldn't be allowed to make this claim. But since they're supplements, and at the bottom of the bottle it says these claims have not been tested, then it's okay. So I think those edge cases are actually pretty hard. But by and large, I think food regulation has been more of a problem than it has been a benefit. So one of the things in the United States, if you look at the history, there was a famous book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. It was about the meat processing industry in the early part of the 20th century. And after the book was written, it talked about the disgusting way that meat processing plants were producing meat that then go out to consumers. And so the US got the Food and Drug Administration. We started to have inspections. And 10 years later, Upton Sinclair said, remember, this is the guy that wrote the book that called for regulation. He said that the regulation has actually made things worse because the regulators now provide protection to these large companies, because now they can say, well, we were inspected. If you try to sue or if you try to pursue legal action against one of these companies, they'll say, well, we were obeying the federal law. So if the question that you asked was at 30,000 feet, way up high, shouldn't we protect the public? Sure. What actually happens? That's not what happens. The government doesn't protect the people. The government cares more about corporations than it does about you. So I understand you can imagine an alternative world where the government is motivated by concern for consumers. It's not, which means that I'm skeptical of the claim, which, although I agree, it would be great if governments were public spirited and cared about consumers. I worry that they don't. And so I am happy to have some kinds of regulation, but I think that we should be skeptical of the grand claims of we're here to help you, when in fact, all of the benefits come from helping corporations. I sound like a Marxist. I realize I sound like a Marxist, that government is going to be controlled by large corporations. But I think it's important to recognize that there is something to that.
Do you think there is or even was an example for actual capitalism that didn't resolve in cronyism?
I love it. I was going to ask the same question.
I love it when a plan comes together. I don't know that there was right now is the golden age for capitalism. And the reason is that we have more liquidity than ever before. One of the reasons that Silicon Valley is so famous is that I can have a meeting at lunch with 3 venture capitalists and I can get $40 million as an investment. So right now is the golden age of capitalism. The problem is right now is also the golden age of cronyism. So we have difficulty both because of the increased power of capitalism, the increased ability to get large amounts of money to make investments. So in terms of AI, in terms of all kinds of infrastructure, right now is the golden age of capitalism. But it's not good. It may be the best, but it's not good because we also have these problems of cronyism. And what I want to do is to go out and have a call for people on my side to recognize that even though capitalism does produce many of the things that we claim for it, it is also true that criticisms from the left, and we've talked about a bunch here. So the criticisms from the left include, how are you going to take care of those who are least well off, who are exposed in a capitalist system to the sort of scolding winds? How are we going to solve the problem of externalities? How are we going to solve the problem of increased rent seeking and desire for protection from all risk? Both of those things are happening at the same time. So I think right now is the golden age of capitalism, but it's not good. Capitalism by its nature is going to have problems. It creates instability, it creates inequality, but it also creates enormous wealth. So if you look between 1900 and 2010, the number of people in poverty has gone from 80% to less than 5%. We have seen a level of prosperity that has never been produced before in the world. And that's due to capitalism. A lot of it is due to, I should say that's due to markets, because a lot of it is due to India and China becoming market systems. They're not really capitalist systems because they don't have liquidity, but they are market systems. They're using prices to allocate resources instead of using government officials. Now, I think China's backsliding. China actually may not be able to sustain its move towards markets, and China may have trouble in the next few years. But you're right to ask, when is the best time? And I'm going to take a chance and say this right now is the golden age of capitalism. It's the best time that's ever been. However, capitalism has always had problems. It has problems now, and we need to recognize that we need to maintain capitalism. It's not something that maintains itself.
Thank you, Mike.